Welcome to OTT Talks, a series of conversations with think tankers, policymakers, and experts around the world. This episode is part of our series with European think tank leaders, reflecting on the work in the rapidly changing environment. My name is Enrique Mendizabal, and I'm co-hosting with Goran Buldioski. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Nathalie Tocci. But first, Goran, why don't you set the scene?
Thank you, Enrique. I'm so glad to announce the fifth series. We are becoming almost like Netflix, in terms of continuing these talks. But it's becoming really interesting because in the previous fourth series, we talked with the leaders of economic think tanks, and now we turn to foreign policy. And there is never a dull moment in foreign policy, but this is a pretty opportune moment because as our guest will tell us more in more detail, geopolitics is not only out there, it actually directly shapes domestic realities, from energy prices to economic stability to even choice of politicians who will lead the country. Unlike other think tank communities, the European foreign policy community has been particularly strong over the last decades, and then actually it has quite a lot both at national level and European level. And we think in these turbulent times it's great to have this series in which we will explore not only their thoughts on the politics of it, but also how they navigate as leaders of these institutions, how they navigate those pressures, and how they remain relevant and impactful. With that, Enrique, back to you to introduce today's guest.
Thank you, Goran. Well, it's a real pleasure to welcome Nathalie. Nathalie is the director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome, one of Europe's leading voices on foreign policy. Nathalie has worked at the intersection of Italian and European policymaker, including as a special advisor to the EU High Representative, contributing to the EU global strategy. And alongside her academic and policy work, she's a widely read commentator and author on Europe's role in the world. Nathalie, welcome.
It's a real pleasure.
So Nathalie, thank you for joining us. And we're going to get into the details of your work and your think tank's work. But since this series is heard and watched by people all over the world, it might be a good idea to start with the context, so others understand where you're coming from. And rather than ask you for sort of an academic treatise on the context of Italy and Europe, maybe we can start with a bit of a light touch question. And so, if the current European or Italian political context, were a movie, which movie would that be, and why?
So I would pick actually an American movie, a movie that I think many people have watched, especially recently, Anderson's One Battle After Another. And why do I think of One Battle After Another if I think of Europe rather than the United States? As we know, I mean, that movie was mainly, in fact, it was about the United States, in a sense, for different reasons, and for different reasons which have to do with the fact that if I think about the context in Europe and the challenges and the threats in Europe, the threats are diverse, they're heterogeneous, they come one after the other. And when one battle is won, we shouldn't assume that the war is won, and there shouldn't be a lowering of the guard, but there should be indeed this understanding that given that the battles are many and they come one after the other, the overall war is ongoing. Now, what war and what battles am I thinking about? And I think the first and the obvious one, right? I mean, the war in Europe, meaning the one that is ongoing in Ukraine, but which, of course, does not begin and end with Ukraine, right? It is both a war which is a much broader confrontation between Europe and Russia, the West and Russia, or maybe it used to be between the West and Russia, and now it's just Europe and Russia, with the United States having flipped sides. But I think as we're also learning, especially as we concentrate a lot on the Middle East, as well, is the way in which these wars are actually interconnected with one another, which goes back to this sense of, one battle after the other. And it reminds me of this image that late Pope Francis used of the Third World War in pieces, which I think really conveys a lot about the current predicament that we're in. And then, of course, the second sense in which there is one battle after another is really as far as the big question of democracy and the future of liberal democracy is concerned. And of course, as we speak, one battle has been won in Hungary, but there shouldn't be the assumption that, again, the war has been won, because it is one battle after another. And because all elections are national elections at the end of the day. And although there may be certain trends which connect, in a sense, different countries, every battle has to be fought and won on its own home ground, right? And so I think there's both this sense of the interconnection between these different battles, but the specificity of each and every one, which, as they said, has to be taken for what it is.
And these are, I was thinking about the film as well, but there are these sort of external battles to some extent, but there are also some internal battles, right? So the Leonardo DiCaprio character is dealing with his own demons and his own battles himself, right?
Well, exactly. Exactly. Sorry, I just interrupted. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. But I think it's just, something like that maybe is happening in Europe as well, right? These external enemies, but I don't want to say internal enemies, but somehow internal battles at least being fought.
Precisely, because I think if we think about what are the threats that are confronting Europe, I tend to think of this as a triangle of threats. So two, ends, two corners of the triangle are external, and it is, the threat from Putin's Russia, the threat from Trump's America, but then there is those two corners would actually be completely manageable were it not for the third internal corner of the triangle, which is the internal threat, which is I call it the reverse J.D. Vance threat. Yeah, it is not the threat from these woke liberals polluting our system and restricting our freedom of expression. It is the threat coming from nationalist-populist far-right forces, which pose a twofold threat. Firstly, they represent a threat to liberal democracy, by definition, given that they self-describe themselves as illiberal. And secondly, they represent a security threat to Europe because they are basically the instrument through which those external players, be it Putin, be it Trump, actually seek to forge empire, quote unquote, in Europe, right? In many ways, both Trump and Putin represent imperial players, and they look at Europe as potential colonies, right? So exactly, Enrique, as you were saying, there is this connection between, the internal battles to be won and the external, where these two things are actually two sides of the same coin.
Interesting. Now, let me ask you a little bit about the context in a wider sense of time, right? So I was looking at your CV, and you started your career, or at least it's what's in your LinkedIn page, at a think tank, some time ago, and you're back at a think tank after having worked in multiple organizations, including think tanks and research centers. What do you think have been the major changes if you compare the context back then, say 10, 15, 20 years ago, with context today, which you've described just now?
Yeah, it's such a world of a difference. So indeed, I began my very first job, as you were saying, in a think tank back in 1999 at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. And I was working on, I just finished my master's thesis, concentrating on EU-Turkey relations. And then I began my PhD while I was working at the think tank on the Cyprus conflict. Now, how was it different from now? Firstly, I would say this was a much, much, much smaller space. There is one anecdote that comes back to mind because for some weird reason, it just came up again. So back then, as I said, I started working there end of 99. Then I began my PhD while working in CEPS on the Cyprus conflict. And these were the years in which the United Nations was developing what eventually became the Annan Plan for Cyprus, which was reached in 2003, put to referendum in 2004, and of course failed. And the rest is history. Anyway, Back then, the UN, Kofi Annan's special envoy, was someone called Álvaro de Soto. So he was a Peruvian diplomat, and he basically was the penholder of what became known as the Annan Plan. Anyway, Nathalie at this point is, what was I, in 2000, was in my remit, it's still operational. And all of a sudden I see this like message, from 26 years ago from Álvaro de Soto. Now, why do I tell this kind of anecdote? Because just think about how much more crowded the scene is today. Would it ever happen that, a sort of envoy, an international envoy, be it the UN, the US, would write an email to some completely unknown junior researcher had just started her PhD in some think tank in Brussels? Now, it wasn't because I was particularly smart, but it's just that there were just fewer people, right? And so you would have that kind of interaction. So I would say one main difference is just how narrow the space was back then in ways which it isn't at all now. The second aspect, which in a sense is related, is that this was really a business, not just think tanks, but I would say foreign policy. It was a business for experts. It was a business for sort of very specialized people. I knew all the ins and outs of the Cyprus conflict and how different models, I was looking at how the Belgian federal model could be applicable or not for a federal solution in Cyprus. And so it was extremely specialized and very, very narrow. And as I said, there were much fewer people. And so those fewer people ended up, even if you were a UN envoy and a 22-year-old junior researcher, ended up making those connections and talking in very specialized terms. Now, what has happened now is that essentially what we see is a much, much bigger space, a much more crowded space, but also the way in which foreign policy essentially is, let's say, far more in the public domain. And this has had necessarily to force think tankers, but not just think tankers, this has forced diplomats. This has, forced officials. This has forced each and every person working on foreign policy to basically have to focus essentially on a much wider sort of set of issues. So I would say it's a much more crowded space. It's in many respects a less specialized space, which means that people that do have a specialization need to be able to translate their specialization to a much, much wider audience.
That's really, really fascinating. And, we spoke a lot about not only the individual dimension, but as well how it's different. But when we look at that, you said that there is an offer for a policy advice, which is much bigger, much richer. What is the uptake for that policy advice? I mean, and does that offer now translates into, when you talk about the business model of think tanks, does it translate also in a wider, or maybe wider because not only foreign policy officials, but as well governments as such in different places need that advice or not?
So I would say, firstly, I would say that it really depends on what we mean by policy advice. And, when I have, for instance, my students, I often, sort of get them to sort of think about how would you write a policy brief and all the rest of it. Now, generally people think of policy advice as I have to give X, Y, Z recommendations. I am increasingly of the view that actually that is not the most useful thing that can be done outside of the institutional machinery, especially if the think tanker in question has not worked within the institutions and has less of a sense of exactly, how the policy making washing machine actually operates. And of course, this is, I think, a problem that is particularly acute in Europe. whereas in the United States, the so-called revolving doors are far more fluid, or at least they were, if you like. In Europe, we have less of a tradition in terms of think tankers working in institutions and then moving back. I mean, there are some people that do this, but very, very few, especially, as I said, if we compare this to the United States. Now, if you do not have that kind of experience, very, very difficult that you will be able to come up with a recommendation that actually has real opportunity for uptake. Simply because, as I said, this is not the UN envoy writing a peace plan and being in the marketplace for ideas. This is about, say, for example, what does, I don't know, the Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union talk about and discuss? You may have a very good idea and you may write a policy brief with a good recommendation. It just so happens that it's not what they're discussing now, right? And so given that there is now this overprint of papers, if, for example, what you do recommend happens to be relevant in the, washing machine cycle of policymaking 3 or 4 months down the line, and it may still be super relevant, what you wrote 3 or 4 months ago, but there has been since then such an overproduction of papers and briefs and commentaries and op-eds and all the rest of it that no one's going to sort of pay any attention to it. So I'm actually increasingly of the view that what is, and is increasingly uptaken, is not so much the specific recommendations, but the work that think tanks do in framing certain questions. So it is about helping to delineate the realm of the possible and possibly shaping that realm of the possible. So it's about how particular questions are framed, what kind of connections are made between issues. And therefore, it's within that space, in the sense that discursive political slack, that then specific recommendations, which will not necessarily be thought by think tankers, will be taken up. So I actually see the complementarity as being one in which think tankers don't try and substitute themselves to policymakers and come up with the kind of things that only policymakers can really come up with, but they're rather complementary to policymakers by providing them that space, that mental space, which at times can be, as I said, discursive, conceptual, but within which then specific recommendations can emerge.
Nathalie, since you operate in, let's say, two realities that of course intersect, but they have their own intricacies, Italian and the European, how does this differ? And especially in today's Italy that has the government that it has, how does this differ? Or are there any nuances that is important to take into consideration when you speak about doing this at the national level and doing it at the European level?
Yeah, I think it's completely different. It's completely different because at the national level, I would say it's a lot more political and less policy. And I think this is true for Italy, but I think it's true actually for all European countries. Actually, there are very few things that you can point to where you would say there is a national foreign policy. National politics on foreign policy issues or on international issues. But I mean, look, what does Italy do in the world? What can Italy do in the world? Yeah. So it's only really relevant in foreign policy terms in a European context, which basically means that what you end up doing or trying to do at national level is more developing relationships and, sort of relationships, connections, so as to try and encourage your national capital to adopt a particular position at European level, which then translates eventually into a policy at European level. Whereas what you would try and do at European level is what I was describing earlier, right? So framing certain issues so that the overall direction that Europeans take on a particular foreign policy question moves in one way as opposed to another. So I would say that it's, as I said, it's a lot more political at national level and less policy, to be honest, but more because there is less policy actually done at national level when we talk about foreign policy as opposed to the European level, which I don't mean to say that it's supranational institutions that make foreign policy at European level, but it's Europeans collectively or European governments as they are represented collectively that then, push forward. And it doesn't have to be all of them at the same time. We're in a world in which whatever coalitions of the willing operate, from Ukraine to Greenland to now Hormuz. So it can be groups of different European countries, but foreign policy is done more at a collective level rather than just a national level, I would say.
That's really interesting. Nathalie, you've talked about this world in which battles keep coming and piling up one after the other, less so maybe 20 years ago. You've talked about a much more crowded space, not just more think tanks, but also more experts, also more institutions, more bodies, also more non-experts posing as experts and having a space in the policy and the political space in which these decisions are being discussed or decisions are being made. You've talked about this dual role of sort of networking, building relationships, becoming the kind of the trusted partner at the local level, which makes sense if it's more political with a big P, and being a technical advisor, a technical operator at the European level. If I go back to what my former boss, Simon Maxwell at ODI, would say to me, it's the best, being a think tank leader is the best job in the world, but it's also the most difficult job in the world. So what does it look like to be a leader of a foreign policy think tank today in this context? What does your day involve? What does your week involve? What are the priorities you have as a leader?
I mean, I think it is, I would say, constantly finding the right balance between three sets of things, or I should say maybe four sets of things. The first is you need to provide overall strategic direction to where you're going. And this is a constant thinking and rethinking of the balance between continuity and change. If I think about my own think tank, that, by the way, I'm leaving actually in only a few days, as I'm ending my last term as director very soon. So I've been, as often is the case when you come to the end of something, that it's an opportunity to really look back. And if I were to describe that first sort of pillar of the work, I would say, how do you remain firm on founding principles? In the case of the Institute for International Affairs, founded back in 1965 by Altiero Spinelli, one of the founding fathers of European integration. I was kind of looking back at the statute that he wrote back in 1965. And, Article 2 of that statute it's all about the founding principles of the Institute, and it's about democracy and human rights and multilateralism and European, obviously, integration, federation in the sense. So to me, it is about remaining firm on the principles. So that's the continuity bit. The change bit is that everything, as we've been describing, around you changes, right? And so in order to remain firm on principles, you also have to change if everything around you is changing. And so, it is about constantly thinking and rethinking about that balance between continuity and change in terms of standing firm on principles, but at the same time, adapting and responding to changing context. And doing it both, in a sense, by communicating internally in the institutes, but also giving your think tank a public voice. And may come back to this later, which I think is an increasingly important aspect of what think tanks do. But anyway, that's, I would say, in a sense, the first and most important pillar. The second pillar, which is really not the very fun pillar at all, is financial. Because as the scene has become more crowded, the pots of money have shrunk. And there has been this increasing project of funding. Very rarely, if ever, do you have funders willing to cover core funding of a think tank. If I think again about IAI, when I first came to the Institute back in 2000, and around 20 or 25% of the funding came from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And today it comes from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There are some projects that are done with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but there's zero core funding coming from the MFA. And so there has been this complete reinvention of a business model where you constantly have to grapple with these contradictions in which the money that you find is project money, and no one wants to cover your kind of, fixed costs, but, you still have to pay rent and you still have to pay salaries and all the rest of it. And so I think, the funding, the fundraising aspect is inevitably something that is crucially important. Not a lot of fun, certainly not for me, but you do have, in case of IAI, between 65 and 70, souls on your conscience that you have to think about. So that inevitably takes up a big amount of time and space. And then I would say the third aspect is more managerial, where, of course, there are different ways of organizing this. And I'm not particularly keen on being a micromanager myself, but inevitably legal responsibility lies in the director. And so you're the one that has to take particular decisions and choices. And I think there's one aspect of this, which, there are many things about management which are actually not very fun at all, but one aspect which I think is a lot of fun, which in a sense it's both a third and a fourth, in a sense, aspect of what leading a think tank, I think, means, which is mentoring. Inevitably, there are people that are working with you in the Institute that look at you as a model, as a potential role model, and that they are grappling with all sorts of choices that we all, face and confront and have faced and confronted as we've moved along. And I find that aspect actually the most rewarding. And this is actually, and it's also the aspect which has really grown on me. Maybe this tells us more about how I'm getting old, but that has grown on me more and more as time has gone on. And actually, this is fundamentally why, as I've thought about, and this is a reflection that has been with me over the last, especially 3 years, sort of thinking to myself, I need to move on to something else. I had never really considered academia because I don't really consider myself an academic. But this mentoring aspect had really grown on me increasingly. And this is, at the end of the day, why I decided that my next stop would be actually leaning more heavily on that mentoring side now in and through a school of public policy, like the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins, where I'm currently based and will be full-time now based. It is precisely because of that third leg, and especially the mentoring dimension of it, that increasingly grew on me.
But you mentioned a fourth element.
It was the management that then
mentorship.
Had mentorship, exactly.
So nurturing the next generation. But I wonder if there is also an element, and I don't know if this has changed over the years. Are you the visible part of, as the leader of the Institute? Are you the visible person to external actors? And is this becoming a greater part of the role as the way we consume information is increasingly through individuals, right? And the algorithms, we are slave to, are prioritizing individuals rather than organizations, rather than bodies of work or cores of people. Do you feel that there is that element to it? And is that, there must be an element of that, but is that changing as well?
Yeah, I actually think, and this may sound a little bit strange coming to me, given that I know I am quite visible, but I think this can also be a problem. What I mean by this is that I actually think it is hugely important for a think tank not to be a person and not to revolve around a person. And so, to the extent possible, to try and give visibility to others in the think tank. Actually, if I think about the media requests that come my way, I would say that a good 90% I turn to others, because I actually think it's hugely important that it is not just the director or the director and the president that have media visibility, but that you try as much as possible to make this everyone's visibility, everyone's individual visibility, which then inevitably leads to collective identity, collective public identity of the think tank. So I think it is very important to try and do so. Now, inevitably, I think if you as a director are more inclined for that public role, and inevitably the media will always kind of look for you more or look for you first, there's a bit of a trade-off there, right? And so I may try and delegate as much as possible, but I'm not necessarily, the more I myself have a public role, the less successful I am in effectively delegating to others, even if this is what I am actually doing or trying to do, right? So I think there's a sort of trade-off there. Does it necessarily mean that directors need to be the public face of an institute? No, I actually don't think so. I mean, if I think about my successor in IAI, I actually think that he will probably, compared to me, have less of a public visibility than I did. And actually, maybe this is a good thing, because maybe he will try as much as I did to make others visible, but maybe because he is less visible, he will be more effective in making others more visible. I'm not sure, it's a little bit contorted what I'm saying. Yeah. So I think public visibility has become an increasingly important role of what think tanks do and trying to inform public debate. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about this in a moment. But I actually don't think that it necessarily has to be the director. There are other individuals in think tanks, and the more you make those voices heard, the more you're actually helping these people eventually in their professional journeys, right? And the more you're actually conveying the sense that a think tank is a think tank. It's not just a group of individual researchers that happen to be kind of, working in the same office.
Mm. That's really, it's fascinating because, as a former donor of think tanks, I have to say, that there used to be also a think tanks with a leader and a secretariat. And to be fair, there is a logic in that model. But I think what you're talking about is exactly where, the rationale why you have a think tank is to be more than any individual, because you add a value in the collective and also the brand. I mean, you mentioned Spinelli. That's really a last century. So actually there is something which is in the brand and the, let's say, accumulated not only knowledge, but relevance over the time. But
Goran,
I would like,
Goran, let me,
go ahead.
Before you go into a very interesting question you're waiting to ask, because this, if I can probe a little bit on this point, because I agree with you, and I've seen many think tanks where leaders have built a body of experts who can go to the media, who can go to the government. At the same time, we do a little bit of research on the other side of the equation with decision makers. And demand there, and I think you were alluding to this in your early answers, demand there is for a bit of more clarity, less of a crowded space, a bit more certainty, fewer trusted voices. And so there's that sort of counter demand, in the sense that saying, well, we want to talk to one person, or we want to talk to someone that we can talk to every day, right? So we can build that rapport that you were saying that you have to build locally in Italy, right? So there's that balance between building a whole organization of experts, which is good for the sustainability of the think tank, and at the same time responding to the particular needs of decision makers that are just overwhelmed with names and brands and documents. And they probably just want one or two people they can talk to on a regular basis on any topic, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is true of policymakers, and I think it's also true of the media. I mean, the media tends to want to talk to one person, right? Now, you can't, and, the policymaker likewise, and that person tends to be the kind of, tip of the iceberg of a think tank, i.e. the director. So how do you balance that? You can't, as I said, I don't think you can push back the whole time. So you can probe, hey, can I send you X or Y or Z, right? Now, if the answer is, no, I really want to talk to you, fine, yeah? Now, I think what's important is that when you do go and talk, firstly, it's not just what you dreamt up that morning. I have always made a point, particularly when it's topics that are not necessarily my specific area of expertise. So say, for example, and this is, I think, more true for the media side than for the policymaker side, but say, I don't know, something happens in Taiwan. I don't know. I'm no Taiwan expert, right? So I would never go and talk to the media without having been thoroughly briefed by my Asia researchers in the Institute. And to the extent possible, I will reference their work. Yeah. So I'm not just conveying the content of what they're saying so that I actually don't sound completely stupid and ignorant, but to the extent possible, I'll be crediting them. So hopefully, as I said, first option is actually get them directly involved. If there's pushback on that, at least try and get their content, directly involved. And to the extent possible, reference that content to the name, to the other name. And so what you can hope to achieve over time is that maybe as time goes on and they hear the name over and over again, maybe they have the bright idea of contacting that name themselves, yeah? So if it doesn't work, it's not a one-shot game, going back to one battle after the other. It's not a one-shot game, it's an iterated game. And so you can help, in a sense, get other people known and other people in that public sphere by kind of, dragging them in, time and time again as much as possible.
But on this, Nathalie, I also find that actually probably one of the roles of the think tanks is as well to structure and organize that debate. Because I understand there is a top-level official and he wants to talk to Nathalie because actually she or he trusts Nathalie. And there's also a bit of a loyalty thing here. And it's not, I do not blame a lot of democratic-minded politicians have been attacked and whatnot. So actually their circles have shrunk, the circles of trust, not necessarily of advice. But then actually I think that's probably even an additional role of the think tanks to structure and have both debates. I mean, you referred to the specific expert debates with the more general sort of political conversations at the beginning of our talk. And I find that more and more not only needed, but as well probably the art of the possible for the think tanks to organize that your colleague who really spends day and night on looking at Asia and Taiwan and whatnot, that also not only that they have a say as a visibility, but actually the nitty-gritty details of that expertise are part of the conversation. They're not overlooked. And I have to say the form, frankly, has to really improve over time because as people have very little time, there's a very little sort of patience to wait for both the general and the specific in that respect. But that was a short comment. I will move to something else. You mentioned about money. I mean, we like to talk on this podcast about the funding. And when you're talking, actually, this is not to push back on you, but I as somebody who is observing a different field of think tanks and like-minded organizations, they're part of organizations that do not have a problem with core institutional funding. On the illiberal side, I follow closely Hungary. Matthias Corvinus Collegium has made the headlines. Probably it has with the 1.3 billion, we'll see whether that will remain, by the way, but with 1.3 billion euros of an endowment, probably it has a bigger endowment than the collective endowments of all foreign policy think tanks in Europe.
1.3 billion.
Correct. That's, I mean, we'll see whether that will remain now with the new government, but that's a different conversation. But no, when you're talking about project funding, I feel, also belonging to, let's say, a liberal wing, although that liberal, illiberal is, I'm using your framing. We both know it's not perfect. I feel, two things. One is that somehow the people on the liberal side put their money where the mouth is, while the liberals are into projectification of the world. And then also, but I would like you to reflect as well, how do you assess the impact in the policy field? Because I feel that they also kind of shifted a lot of debates, unsettled a lot of people, not only the politicians, from Bardella, from Meloni, but as well the thinkers or the people that were doing the more, let's say, intellectual / policy side. So feel free to react to both the funding story, but as well the policy side of that, especially given that you operate in Italy, that it's in its own, it's a laboratory of this kind of hybrid system, I would say.
Yeah, well, I'm still sort of under the kind of shock of 1.3 billion. Wow. That's just absolutely extraordinary. Also because, I don't know, and you're far more knowledgeable than I am on this question, I suspect that perhaps not all the 1.3 billion is actually Hungarian money. And it may be that it, in a sense, transited through Budapest, but was coming from different directions, from Silicon Valley to the Kremlin. And so, which I think speaks to, going back to the other side of the fence, two sets of issues on the funding side. The first is that, and it goes back to this discussion about, what is it exactly that you're funding? And the tragedy, I think, is in Europe particularly, that this allocation of funding has happened within already an ecosystem where kind of philanthropy has always operated very differently from, for example, the United States, right? So already when, even before this projectification of funding, it was a more constrained space in Europe. This kind of reminds me, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but I'll say this anyway, of, when we were doing interviews for my successor in IAI, and there was an absolutely brilliant candidate, but she was based in the US and she'd been working in the US for many years. And, when kind of answering a question about what would you do on the funding side in terms of strategy, she was talking about philanthropy and unrestricted funding. And I was like, oh my God, boy, she really hasn't lived in Europe for a long time. And this is even before we got into this space where, in a sense, there's competition with unrestricted funding on the other side of the fence. So I think there's an element of that, but also connected to the point I was making about the hypothetical, it's only a hypothesis, but the connections that may have existed between, in a sense, Budapest, Moscow, whatever, Silicon Valley and the like, is that there's an element of network, which I think is completely lacking, or at least more lacking on the, let's say, liberal progressive side. This is why, for example, I found it so interesting. A few days ago, I was in Barcelona for this progressive, global progressive mobilization. And that's obviously not on the think tank or philanthropy side. That's very much on the political side. But it stems from a very similar observation. And the very similar observation is that the nationalists have actually become far more and globalized than the presumed globalists, right? And, maybe we should do something about it, not necessarily in developing a joint agenda, but in just creating more networks, sort of understanding and figuring out how we can support one another more, understanding the different predicaments that we may have. So I think just in the same way as it applies to the political sphere, I think it applies to the, in a sense, philanthropic and think tank and NGO sphere. I feel that if one is to look at what the upside of this whole, oh my God, MCC 1.3 billion story is, that it is a moment of a wake up, right? in the same way as politically, it has been a wake-up moment. The minute in which you see whatever the US vice president campaigning, be it in Germany, be it in Romania, be it most recently in Hungary. So I think this wake-up moment is actually instilling a sense of, hey, you've got to do something about it, both in terms of the kind of funding available, but also, and even, in a sense, even more importantly, the connection made between different institutions, organizations operating on the other side of the fence.
That's really interesting. Yes, I think that's the reading that many people are arriving at. Right? It's just the complication of knowing what's your peer group, right? So is it progressiveness? Is it pro-democracy? Is it
as wide a tent as possible? It should be. But this is
exactly.
this is because I don't think that we should be in the business of trying to develop a joint agenda.
Right, yeah.
We will all have our different agendas, but if we agree on the very basics, that liberal democracy is a good thing in a European context, that European integration is a good thing, and multilateralism and international, we don't actually need to agree on anything else. We can have profound disagreements on all sorts of policy questions, and in fact, that's the kind of purpose, right, of being on a liberal side of the fence. But just kind of agree on that basic sort of foundation, and seeing, in that tent that needs to be as wide as possible, how those connections can be fostered.
Yeah. Nathalie, you're moving on from leading a leading European think tank, you're moving into academia. Let me ask you a little bit about the personal aspect of the job. What has been the most sort of rewarding aspects of it, and maybe what have been the personal costs involved?
Yeah. So the most rewarding aspect is by far, sort of having this sense that you have this little gem that has such a important and proud history, and precisely in this historical period when those foundational values, which once upon a time were not even political, right? I mean, everyone, be it on the right or on the left, agreed that international law and human rights and democracy and European integration were good things, right? And so, in a sense, steering an institute like IAI in this transition from, living in a world in which you didn't even understand what you did as political. You understood what you did as policy, but not political. And all of a sudden you acquire, because the context has changed, that political role, which in a sense obliges you to acquire a public role, to think about mentoring, to think about training, to think about comms in ways in which just kind of wasn't on your radar at all. So I think having steered that transition and leaving an institute which is bigger, stronger, younger, more diverse, in all sorts of ways, is something that I'm extremely proud of. Now, I also felt that, leading a think tank means, it comes back to the different pillars I was referring to earlier. You spend a lot of time in doing things that you're not 100%, sort of keen on. As I said, I don't find it personally fun to go asking for money. I don't find it particularly fun. I mean, some people do. I don't. Thinking about salaries and promotions and demotions and, the sort of more managerial side of things. So I just kind of felt, okay, fine, I've done this. I don't feel like doing it anymore. And I think it's time to move on and sort of dedicate more of my overall pie to the things I do enjoy more, which essentially revolve around content on the one hand and mentoring on the other.
And Nathalie, if you try to put which song that would be?
Okay, so actually I remain on a very similar sort of wavelength. I don't know if you've got a chance, because it's just been released, to listen to the new Massive Attack, Tom Waits, Boots on the Ground. Again, a song which is thought about, thinking about the United States, but that I think that in different ways is extremely relevant for Europe, not only because, of course, there are boots on the ground going back to war in Europe, but also, and kind of circling back to this conversation about think tanks, because think tanks themselves have to be far more hands-on in the public sphere, sort of on the front lines, if you like, of these different battles that we've been discussing about. So they need to be far more boots on the ground in a metaphorical sense, compared to when they could afford to be in their, sort of areas of kind of specialization and just interacting in very civilized way with policymakers that spoke the same language, were in the same headspace and followed the same sense of direction. So in a sense, think tanks need to be far more, boots on the ground, in a sense, in a sense, very metaphorical sense compared to what they were in the past.
Thanks, Nathalie. I have to say, as a big fan of Massive Attack and Tone Waves, I feel like at loss that I somehow, where's my social feed here, and social network feed?
But this is only,
it
is last week, so you are
okay,
excused.
but still, last week could be last century in this modern world. But and Enrique, I think we have to plug in somehow Wes Anderson. It seems that he's uber popular with the think tankers. This is already a second movie in succession.
Oh,
we had a
wow.
guest previously who actually used the Budapest Hotel
Fantastic.
as the movie to describe the context. I think we're getting there. And Nathalie, after this interview, I'm immediately checking out what this song is about. But before we go into that, Enrique, you go with the last question for our conversation today.
Sure. I think this is looking into the future, right? You've given us a very thorough description of the context and the role, the job of being a think tank leader in this context. And you alluded to the future in this last reflection. So I guess the question is, what is the advice you would give future think tank leaders as they prepare for the job?
I think that, and I could go back to continuity and change. I think there needs to be a very clear sense of purpose. And that sense of purpose, in a very deep sense, does not change. So I think, say you begin your job as, you've just been hired as director of a think tank, whether you were already in that think tank or whether you were coming from outside, you need to do your homework on really what the history of the place is, what its purpose is, what its political, as I said, with a big P is, and how that needs to be safeguarded, protected over time. I think that's hugely important, which really has to do also with the identity of the think tank. At the same time, there needs to be a lot of openness. You need to be, 360-degree open to the way in which, in order to fulfill that mission and that vision, you need to be able to change yourself, change others. There are no limits in terms of what can be done, what should be done in order to achieve it. And so having this double sort of lens and making sure that as a think tank director develops it, he doesn't or she doesn't develop it in their little castle, but does it with the entire organization. And this comes back to the point of, a think tank not just being a collection of individuals, starting with the director, but actually being more than the sum of its parts, which also means that strategy and the development of strategy needs to be a collective enterprise.
That is very, very good advice for future think tank leaders. Nathalie, it's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah.
You can listen to this and other podcasts in the series wherever you listen to your podcasts or by visiting onthinktanks.org. From Goran and from me, goodbye.